good afternoon and welcome to the Scrutiny Committee at Norwich City Council. Today we'll be predominantly looking at the pre-scrutiny of the council budget. Although this meeting has been conducted virtually and broadcast on the council's YouTube channel, any decisions and recommendations made today will have the same validity as if the meeting were happening at City Hall. Item 1, apologies. I have no apologies today. Thank you. Item 2, any declarations of interest from members of the committee? No declarations of interest, thank you. I had no public questions or petitions. Item 4, minutes. Are members happy that I can sign the minutes as being an accurate record of the last meeting? Please indicate. Yeah, lots of thumbs up for that, so thank you. Item 5 is the Scrutiny Committee work programme. The main item we need to agree for that is what we scrutinise at the March meeting of the Scrutiny Committee. The suggestion at the moment is that we look at a workshop around the formulation of the procurement strategy. I have discussed that ahead of the meeting with members of the committee, and there is agreement on that. So rather than spending too long dwelling on that, can everyone just sort of indicate for the benefit of the officers that you're happy to take that approach? Lots of thumbs up, so thank you. So that will form the basis of the March scrutiny. So we're now on to item 6, which is the scrutiny, the pre-scrutiny of the budget. So I'd like to welcome the many council officers who've joined us today to assist with our deliberations and discussions around the budget, and also Councillor Kendrick, who I believe will say a few words to introduce the report, and then I'll hand over after Councillor Kendrick to Annabelle Scholes, who will give an outline from a financial officer perspective. So Councillor Kendrick, if I can hand over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I shall give a short introduction and hand over to the Chief Finance Officer to give a more detailed presentation. The papers presented are the proposed revenue budgets for the financial year 21-22, the General Fund and Housing Revenue Account, alongside the proposed capital programme and Treasury Management Strategy. The pressure on the resources available to run vital day-to-day services remains extremely challenging as the result of increasing demand and the ongoing impact of the COVID pandemic. The budget proposes includes a 1.99% increase in council tax, along with permanent savings, additional income and one-off funding confirmed as part of the provisional finance settlement. In addition, short-term COVID-19 related growth items have been identified, with the council's car parking and retail rental incomes being most affected. To address these, a number of short-term saving options have also been proposed, such as changing the approach to funding capital programme and reducing external borrowing costs. Despite the need to deliver savings, the council has worked hard to protect frontline services again next year and has avoided the need for service cuts. Furthermore, the budget for 21-22 has been balanced without the need to draw down on reserves. However, it is clear that pressure on the council's finances will continue over the coming years. A further estimated 11.8 million will be needed to be saved by 25-26, due to the amount of funding provided to local councils being adequate to keep pace with the demand for local services. Challenges will require cutting services reviews to drive forward the savings options for future years. Despite the extremely challenging financial position, the General Fund Capital Programme includes a proposed 42.4 million of investments over the next 5 years. This includes investments in vital city and skills infrastructure funded to the council's successful bid for the £25 million of the town's deal funding. The HRA budget includes a proposed rent increase of 1.5% to enable the council to continue to invest in existing and new homes. This investment is reflected in the capital programme, where a proposed 5-year programme totalling £207 million is being proposed. This will deliver significant investment in council housing, as well as over 300 new council homes. I'm also very glad to report that Norwich City Council will remain one of the few councils in England that will continue to offer a 100% council tax reduction scheme, which is so important to the poorest in our city. Coming at a time when the entire local government sector is under extreme pressure, and as I said at the last council, the costs of COVID have not been fully funded by the government, and that many councils are having to make further cuts in services they provide. It stands as a remarkable achievement that this Labour administration is able to present such a budget as this. This is not a budget of cutbacks, it is a budget of investment. Investment in our assets, investment in our services, and investment in the people of Norwich. Can I finally just say one thing? Being 62 and having spending many hours doing Zoom and Teams meetings, I'm sure you won't be entirely surprised that I'm suffering from eye strain, and my optician has advised me to look away from the screen as much as possible. So if members do see the back of my head or the side of my head, it's not that I'm not paying attention, or I'm not listening, or I'm being rude, nothing like that. So I'm just following medical advice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Kendrick, for that introduction. I'd like to hand over to our Chief Finance Officer, Annabelle Scholes, to give a more detailed presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll try not to repeat the introduction and the key sort of data sets that Paul's provided us there, but fundamentally it has been another challenging year for us. The kind of background to that, though, is this position we find ourselves in of getting one-year settlements. Now, we fully understand this year with the pandemic why it was difficult to provide a 3-year settlement to us, but it will be something that as professionals we'll be pushing for moving forward. We really want to get back to a position where we've got a 3-year settlement so we can do some more medium-term planning, because the 1-year settlements do make it very difficult. And as you can tell from the previous papers we took to Cabinet, we didn't know in December what our settlement would be. So actually, though, what we can now see today is a really positive move, that actually we've been provided additional one-off funding to help support some of those challenges we have. So in the budget papers, you will have seen that there's over £3 million of short-term pressures that we're having to deal with due to the ongoing effect of COVID. And I just wanted to share with you what we've done in the financial assumptions is not assumed that next year we're going to be back to where we were a year ago. We're taking 2 years to try and manage the impact of COVID, and hopefully we will start to see that recovery coming back. So we've had to take a longer term than a 1-year view on some of the impacts on COVID. But what we do still have in the budget, and it's important that we do discuss this, is actually there is a structural gap of 2.2 million. So I'm really pleased to be sitting here proposing a budget that is balanced and no drawdown on the general reserve, but it just demonstrates the short-term nature of some of the funding we've had to support that position. And actually we need to work on that going forward so we have a sustainable ongoing budget. The medium term, though, forecast totally addresses that position. Councillor Kendrick mentioned the fact that we're now looking at 11.8 million over the medium term. That is an increase from where you were last February, but a slight reduction in some of the assumptions we'd taken sort of midpoint year. So again, we are addressing all of these challenges, but it does still show what a journey that we need to go on over the medium term. Something that we've looked at as part of the technical work I need to do to give assurance around the budget is look at the prudent minimum level of reserves. We are actually slightly proposing an increase in that. But what it's important to know that this isn't meant to be addressing something like a pandemic happening again. It's just looking at what our day-to-day risks are and whether they have moved slightly from where we were a year ago. So my current proposal is around having a prudent minimum level for the general fund of 5.1 million. What you can see over the medium term in the papers, though, is that if we continue to work on the basis of a smoothing approach of savings, which is something that's worked very well for the council and something we're proposing to continue. If our funding doesn't change, we will be in a position, though, by the year 24-25, where we're back down to a prudent minimum level on the general fund. So that's just something I wanted to share with you. What we have done in the budget papers, though, is back in December, we talked to you about proposing a risk reserve. This is something that I've seen done in other councils, and it's just acknowledging the fact that we do have lots of challenges, that we can't know everything at the time we set the budget. And fundamentally, what that will help us with is any kind of slippage we might come across in delivering some of the savings proposals. We still have some detailed consultation to do, and it's important that we create some capacity to be able to manage consultation and provide appropriate steps going forward. So we have got a proposed risk reserve that we're putting in the budget papers, but we've also got another really positive business change reserve, which is more about supporting the organisation change and evolve so it can address the issues that we have in local government. You can see how local government's changed and adapted in this last year, dealing with the issues of the pandemic. Local government's been absolutely key to that, and all the work we're doing with our grants, supporting businesses, and whether it's the individual single payments, we've really had to adapt and change. And then we've obviously got the whole COVID team with the hubs that have been established, supporting people with food. We really have adapted and changed. And what we want to be able to do, though, is make sure we've got a business change reserve that can help do some of that change if it's needed. What we need to address is the fact that not all change will save money, but change can bring good things and additional capacity. So we're establishing a change reserve. Some of that is about investing in our people. We're going through the senior management restructure now, and that's going to flow through the whole organisation. And it's important that we can invest in our people to be able to address that. So that's another big sort of change in the reserves proposals that we've got going forward. I think that's really all I wanted to touch on for now, if that's okay, Chair, because I do think the papers provide the detail and we can take questions as we go through the sections, but that's what I wanted to sort of introduce.
Thanks very much for the introduction. Just to sort of set out how I think we should proceed now, there are a number of sections in the report. Section 1 is the local government finance, economic and statutory context. Section 2, the general fund. Section 3, the HRA housing revenue account. Section 4, capital strategy. Section 5, non-financial commercial investment. And Section 6, treasury management. What I propose is that we'll look at each one of those sections as a self-contained unit with questions, discussion and recommendations before moving on to the next section. Section 1 is quite general, and so if you have any questions that relate to sort of general aspects of the budget that aren't covered in sections 2 to 6, then please ask those in as we move on to section 1. So without any further ado, Councillor Osborne, you have a question on section 1. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It is sort of a general question. It's not specifically about the local government finance context, but it's a general question about the budget and about the consultation process. So clearly, you know, we've done a consultation, including the easy read consultation. That's on such a complex document. It's quite, you know, it's that sort of consultation is inevitably, and don't get me wrong about this, but it's inevitably quite tick box in nature. And I'm wondering whether there's thoughts about changing the consultation process in the future to have more of a sort of engagement focus as opposed to post-fact consultation. And it may be that that's already been done, but it's not necessarily evident in the report.
Nikki,
do you want me to come in here? Okay, so I think probably the first thing to say is this is the largest response we've ever had to a budget consultation. So that was in terms of numbers, it was the largest response we've had. This was very much, Councillor Osborne, the high level thematic consultation that we do, and you're quite right, these are very, very complex documents. But you can see from the appendix, I think, that you've had, that we've had a response to the questions around council tax, so quite a high level response. The number of people that have responded are also across tenure across the city, right across the city in terms of postcodes. So what we'd normally do in the case of this would be to do the high level bit that we need to do and along those themes and along whether people agree with us raising council tax, agree with our general approach to savings. And then if there are key things within the budget taken forward that we then need to maybe have to go out and do some more consultation on in more detail. So this is a start of a process, it's not the end of it. But for for this particular budget, we weren't going out and asking about a whole slew of services that the council was going to remove or reduce, and certainly not frontline services. So as we get more into sort of granular detail as the council goes forward, and we may have to look at reshaping our services, that's where we'd have some of those conversations, I think. But in terms of this was always meant to be high level and thematic, and then able to drill down for very specific things. But going forward, it's how we look at using our teams through feedback we get for services, and how we would shape those in the future. So I know that's a kind of a slightly sort of high level answer to a high level consultation, but I think that's what we saw from this. But it was the numbers were astonishing for us who responded to the consultation, and they were across tenure, they were right across the city, and from organisations as well. So but something to build on, I think.
Thank you for that. Councillor Osborne, do you have a follow-up to that?
Yeah, I suppose my point is, I mean, Nikki sort of answered it. I suppose my point is more about engagement pre-writing the budget rather than post. Yeah.
And I think if we'd been in a position where we were pre-writing a complete redesign of all our services, then yes. But I think in terms of this was about were people happy with our approach? And as I say, you know, I'm confident that the cross section of people who responded, of course, there were some people who said I didn't really understand that bit, and I might want, you know, we got thousands of comments which we're analysing. We also asked people to give their views on what they thought we could do going forward in terms of did they have any ideas for options, and we had a qualitative box under each of the questions so people could kind of give us comments on them, and of course we'll take that forward and use that as really good granular information going forward. Is that okay, Jamie?
Yeah, thanks. I think that's yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Mccartney-Gray next, then Councillor Giles.
Hi there. I just have a question about the integrated impact assessment, specifically on pages 39 and 40. For financial inclusion, safeguarding children and adults, health and well-being, and on page 40, advancing equality of opportunity. We've put that down as a neutral, but when you actually, my interpretation of the budget, which is obviously going to be different from everyone else, is that this is having a positive effect of those that are most disadvantaged in our community. So I was kind of expecting to see the impact to have been down as positive. Just a general query.
Who will pick that one up, please?
Yeah, I'm happy to respond to that, Councillor Mccartney, but I think we tried to give the very much overarching view of where we were positioned in it. And because of the fact that we've got this really positive position that we're not impacting dramatically on frontline services that would have any particular impact on a group, we felt that it was fairly neutral. And that's the approach we took in relation to that. When we look at any specific service change, and there will be a separate impact assessment done at that point on that specific service change. But in the budget paper, we have now incorporated a high level overview of an equality impact assessment, and that is actually forming part of the cabinet papers. So you get a little bit more detail now in the cabinet papers about the overarching budget and that position and our consideration of equalities and the impact it's got. So I hope that will hopefully address some of the things that you're mentioning.
That's lovely, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Giles.
Thank you, Chair. Starting on a high level, I was going to ask what do Cabinet members and officers believe is the best mechanism for the government sustainably funding local government going forwards? Do we think it's simply by putting more money into the revenue support grant as they used to do? Or is there an alternative, or are there alternative mechanisms we feel they should be using? And the second question I was going to ask was with regards to the OBR prediction for unemployment nationally, how that compares to locally. Thanks.
Okay, so if I can answer the first about the funding and the approach, there's many different ways that we could move forward in reviewing the funding formula for local government. But I think the thing from a finance professional perspective is about making sure it's clear and transparent, and we know and understand the basis on which it's moving forward. So if we want to go down the route, if we want more local control, we need to understand that we fully do have that. And you will see through the changes that we had in business rates, it went part way to seeing that local areas could impact and influence the amount of money that it received. But actually, because it didn't change structurally the basis on which it shared out business rates across the country, it was a real hybrid of how it went forward. And I think that's just the thing we need to be mindful of going forward. Every approach that is proposed and taken needs to be considered in the context of what the impact it has across the country. And fundamentally, I haven't yet seen a proposal that is as clear and localised as maybe we would like, so that we can actually influence in the way we want to go forward. But that is one of the things that we're sort of constantly working on, is making sure that we do have the flexibility locally to be able to make decisions. But where we are currently is we do rely on central support to be able to make sure that we can provide the services we've got. So I can't sit here and say I would say this would be my preference, I'm afraid, but the reality is there are lots of different ways of doing it. But as we stand at the moment, we don't quite have the position where local government has got enough money to be able to address all the issues that it's facing. I don't know whether Councillor Kendrick wants to come in.
No, thank you. Adam Clark, I think, can pick up the unemployment question. Adam?
Yeah, so just briefly on that, the figures in terms of unemployment rate, obviously everywhere has seen an increase over the last year, particularly between March and May last year. Norwich is about in line in terms of percentage per capita unemployment rate with the rest of the country, but higher than the rest of Norfolk. Realistically, modelling forward is going to depend on individual sectors, and we know that we have some particular sectors in the city which are susceptible to maybe a slower bounce back, such as retail, but with the change in shopping patterns. But there are also other sectors that will sort of see increased employment rates, so the care sector, for example. We're doing a bit of analysis of some of those figures, but obviously all of that will then start to read through into our tax base and demand for our services. So that's part of the context in which the corporate plan and budget setting for subsequent years will need to be considered.
Thank you for that. Do you have any follow-up, Councillor Giles?
No, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Ryan, I think you have a question next, please.
Thank you, Chair. Annabelle mentioned business rates. I wondered if it was a good time to mention the loss of two majors on our high street, Debenhams and Topshop. It's going to leave a big hole in Norwich city centre. And I wondered how this would affect the council business rate wise, how much we're going to lose from these two majors leaving our high street.
So I don't have the specific values for both of those from a business rates perspective, but I can give you assurance that we were aware of one of them. So we dealt with that in the assumptions that we got specifically, but we do make an allowance for our kind of forecast on where we believe the business rate from a total perspective will be moving. And we have been fairly prudent in those assumptions, but obviously what we didn't know when we were setting the budget, and we still don't know, is what government will be providing support for going forward. So for example, we had a lot of support this financial year in relation to the retail sector, and we don't yet know what that support will be next year. But we know the budget is on the 3rd of March, and we're getting hints that potentially we might want to hold on billing until we basically have heard the budget. That's a decision I need to make, you know, professionally, because normally we would bill as soon as we've approved the council tax position. So we just need to be mindful of that there's still quite a few unknowns about where the support will come from centrally, but we have made quite a prudent approach, and we have built in, unfortunately, a deficit position that will be spread over the next 3 years from that forecast, and we just need to be mindful of that it is something we're having to manage. But we were given certain tools to enable us to spread that over 3 years, and we have done that.
So what you're saying, Annabelle, is there could be some chance of the government offsetting the loss of Debenhams and a Topshop in our high street?
There could be more generic retail support. So if a company goes into administration, then we won't get support for that. That will just be dealt with through our write-off process and any call we can have on the administrators on getting some of that money back. They won't deal with specifics like that, but what they may help is the prevention of other businesses not being able to stay live and basically still be trading in the future. And that's where we hope we will continue to get that support that we've seen this year to make sure we have less companies being in a position where they're actually going into administration. So
as a rule of thumb, are we talking tens of thousands of pounds here we're losing? Roughly give us some idea of how much this could hit us.
If you will enable me to, I will take away the specific questions and look up rather than making a guess.
Okay.
I don't know the specifics, I'm afraid, Councillor Ryan, but potentially we are talking, you know, a six-figure sum. But let me check the specifics of the questions you've asked, and I'll come back to you.
All right, thank you, Annabelle. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Any other questions on this sort of section 1 or general questions at this stage, please? No.
I think Leslie's got her hand up. James.
Councillor Osborne, was that?
I think Leslie's got her hand up.
Oh, sorry, I hadn't seen her down there. Councillor Graham, please.
Thank you. This is a general point and it comes up in several sections. It's about our criteria for investing, for using our money, for assessing our assets. And that's that we're really strong on making sure that money is safe, that it's secure, that we have good liquidity before we look at yield. I would like to know about
Councillor Graham, you've gone mute, unfortunately.
Sorry, did you hear anything I said?
Up until the point you said, I would like to know about.
Okay, in our procurement policy, we talk about social return on investment. And I would like us to add a fourth criteria for future years that looks at co-benefits, social benefits, some other criteria as well as the financial ones, so that when we're managing our money, and I would congratulate officers on managing our money incredibly well, but I would like to see for future years to be making sure that when we spend our money, that spending is compatible with our values. So we've looked before at ethical investments and found it very difficult. We haven't looked so much at pro-social investments. It's actually much easier to know that you're doing something good than it is to know that you're avoiding doing something bad. And I would like to see a part of the reserves perhaps set aside for pro-social investments, and wonder if that's something that we might possibly do this time around or next time around.
Thank you, Councillor Graham. Annabelle?
So what we haven't actually got, if you don't mind me explaining, is a specific reserve for investments. So what we're doing is constantly managing the cash flow of the organisation and saying how much money have we got that's going to be available. And what we don't want to do is just to hold it in our own bank account. What we want to make sure is we're trying to get some kind of interest earning position on that. Unfortunately, where we're at the moment with base rates so low, safety is the primary focus that we've got, because literally I have to pay the debt management office, the government, to hold our money at the moment because interest rates are so low. So we're in a position where it is about more safety rather than return. We have been asked before to look at the ethical side of it. We do have Treasury Management Advisors, and I'm very willing to talk to them about whether there's more open fund management that explains the type of investment they've got. But what we have focused on, there isn't something that I can say to you today. I'd like to bring that forward as an option, but we are very aware it's something that members want us to keep looking at. Our Treasury Management Advisors are aware of that as well, and I hope as soon as something comes to the market that is good for a cash management position, then we'll look to do that. It's not a long-term investment that we're looking at here, because this is about our day-to-day cash movements and what we're managing. So I need to ensure I'm in a fund fund that's liquid, and I can be able to call on it at a moment's notice, which is why we like to use the money market funds, because we can call them back on the day. Other areas where I have to do a longer term investment, I have to have much more clarity about the movement of cash in the organisation. And the one thing I just can share with you, this year has been the hardest year on cash management for us. I've spent far more time with the team and Hannah working on what our day-to-day cash movements are, trying to forecast those, because we just didn't know how quickly our council tax income would be affected, our business rates, and fundamentally we had to be very, very careful. So we've kind of shortened the type of investment we do, so that we've got investments less than 3 months at the moment, so that we can turn that around, because we can go and temporarily borrow, but we'd rather not. So we're trying to keep our cash fairly liquid, and that's why we're taking that approach. But it is something we're mindful of, and I will constantly be looking for an appropriate fund if we can find something that helps address some of those issues you would like us to.
Thank you. Annabelle, just picking up on that, is the potential for a move to negative interest rates likely to have an impact on the amount of money you're having to pay to basically have the council's money held with some of these funds?
Yes, it would do, because even our accounts where we were getting a 1 or 2 basis points above base rate are now just dropping off, and literally everywhere we're looking at, we're talking 3 or 4 basis points to do an investment. I'm not even looking at 10 basis points if I get out to 9 months. So the reality is, unfortunately, interest rates for cash are just very, very low at the moment, and yes, we could be in a position where it turns to a negative, which is what I'm seeing with the debt management office already.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Osborne.
Yeah, can I just come in on the point about treasury management? I appreciate what Annabelle's saying. I suppose this is sort of jumping ahead to section 6, but it might be, the principles that we've got for the treasury management strategy are security, liquidity, and yield. And it might just be a case of adding in as a 4th principle social value, and presumably we can ask the treasury management advisors to do that. So that's a potential recommendation. It would technically fall under section 6 rather than this section.
Okay, we'll park that then for the time being. Any further questions, or does anyone want to have any discussion on the more sort of general, broad issues, or failing that, we can then crack on with the general fund, which I'm sure many people will be interested in. Anything else at this stage? No? Right, great. Well, let's move on to section 2, which is the general fund. I'd like to kick off with a question that I have first, and it relates to the proposal to bring in income from parking in our parks. Whilst none of us will question the need to raise income coming into the council, given the perilous state that the government wishes to leave local government in, I just wonder, and it's not clear from the papers that we have before us today, whether the potential knock-ons to local residents who might have parking on their verges, outside their houses, near the parks, whether that's been considered. And it'd be helpful if someone was able to give some sort of comment on that, and also how secure we are in the likelihood of getting in the 50,000 a year, which is referenced in the document. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Wright. I can comment on that. So the numbers that are in the budget are a prudent assumption based on some work that's been done by the team. The first phase of consideration of this will be a piece of detailed work which will take into account potential scheme charges, but also, as you've mentioned, kind of impacts and longer term kind of capital investment required. So that first phase of work will need to be completed before a scheme will be presented to Cabinet for approval.
Okay, thank you for that. I've got Councillor Carlo next, and then Councillor Mccartney-Gray.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I'd like to ask, please, about budget option 8 on page 69. A couple of lines there. It says, to commercially run community centres, possible change to commercial let / sale for 2 to 3 properties. The the possible income generation is very modest. It's set at £33,000 for 2021. Yet the implications for these pilots, the community centre committees and the wider communities they serve are large. So I wanted to know if we can see the background papers, please, before this proposal goes forward, and to ask which community centres are being considered, how much consultation there's been amongst the community centre community. I'm concerned that the option might go forward to Budget Council at the end of February and be agreed without really any detailed investigation or understanding of its implications by councillors. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Carlo. Again, this is an element of the budget that will be consulted on, and as the kind of proposals will be firmed up, and that information will be there'll be more detail provided around that. At the moment, there are some assumptions made about some community centres where there is some commercial activity happening, and it will be those elements that we'll look at.
Thank you for that, Louise. Councillor Carlo, do you have a follow-up to that?
Yes, I think I do, yes. In Nelson Ward, which I represent, we've got a very successful community centre, and I think they probably do run some commercial activities. So I'm wondering if there's been consultation or approaches to individual community centres. Do other community centres aware of this option? Whether you're looking at the community centres which are successful in terms of money they currently bring in, or looking at centres which actually are less successful. So there is obviously a difference between the community centres in Norwich, but nonetheless they're all very important, valuable centres, and the community centre committees do an incredible job, and I would be concerned that the committees may not be aware of these proposals.
Thank you, Councillor Collier. Sorry, I may not have been entirely clear in my previous answer. We will go out and consult with the community centres, and we'll do that piece of work to understand, what the options are around it. So as yet, that hasn't been done.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Mccartney-Gray next, please.
I think you may have just answered my question. It was going back to the parks and open spaces and parks parking charges. This is potentially going to affect some roads in the ward that I represent. I assume that by looking at this new income stream, from this particular service area, that there were other options that were looked at before this was put forward in the consultation document as one of the best of a bad world.
Annabelle, I wonder if I could ask just for a bit of help with that one.
So I think, well, Councillor Mccartney, could you just clarify what you mean by best of a, did you say?
So when you're looking at trying to generate income or to make savings in a particular service area, there are usually a number of options that you look at, and you pick the best, what you believe is the best one for that particular area. So rather than make cuts, you are going to generate income for that area so that you are not making the cuts. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I think, okay, so the context of the budget and the positive outcome that we've achieved through the budget is actually we aren't impacting on frontline services. A lot of what we've managed to achieve through what we're doing is by thinking differently, is by looking at the efficiency of the back office services and making sure we are as efficient as possible so we protect those frontline services. There are some proposals in here though that will impact on particular areas, but that is because of the facilities that are there. And I know from some of the discussions we had about the parks was actually the local community, the park is there and they will be able to still utilise it and not be impacted by the charges. But actually a lot of the footfall is coming from outside of the city. Therefore, by utilising that facility, we are actually supporting our own community by actually bringing in some revenue from outside of the city. So there isn't one simple answer to some of this, I'm afraid, but what I do know is if you go and visit other areas where there are parks available, I haven't for a long time not had to pay and display as I've arrived at a place that isn't my local area. And I think that's just something that we need to be mindful of, that there are a lot of developments on these type of approaches to income generation that actually other places have done quite a while ago. And unfortunately, we're just at the place with the budget now here where we need to start looking at some of those issues and taking them forward. And this was just one of the proposals that came forward that has been accepted to move forward to the budget.
Okay, thank you. That's lovely.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Osborne next, then Councillor Giles. Councillor Osborne.
Thank you. Yes, just on the parking at parks, a sort of brief comment about ring fencing the money for improvements to access to green space for people who may not otherwise have it, or whether it's possible to ring fence that money towards other objectives as a suggestion. My question though is about on page 50, we talk about, and Annabelle, you mentioned this at the very start, about sort of putting our surplus into, or the underspend from this year into a reserve. And I'm interested to know how does that actually mean that we're basically creating a bigger reserve than we have had previously? I don't quite understand that. And how will that reserve be used to provide services or deliver value at a time when we're in quite an emergency at the moment?
Yeah, so what we've decided to propose is that we took some really tough decisions as a council mid-year. Fundamentally, you weren't aware at the point those decisions were taking what funding you would get from central government. But what we've decided to propose is that we continue taking all of those actions that we took to be able to ensure you kept within the budget envelope that you had at the outset. And that fundamentally has moved us into a position now where we are seeing some potential underspends. Now, until I get to the end of the financial year and we see the full impact of this third lockdown, we don't really know what the outcome will be. But we are projecting at the moment a positive outcome of the financial year. And what we want to do is those two reserves that I mentioned earlier, the one being the risk reserve. We know, as we've discussed in some of these questions here, we've still got a bit more work to do to be really clear on what the final proposal will be, where we need to do detailed consultation. So I needed to ensure that I got capacity to give the time to be able to do that if it meant there was any potential impact on their final saving or additional income that we can achieve. So that is why the risk reserve is there. It's something that a lot of authorities have been doing a little while, because the more you get into needing to do more challenging savings, the harder it is to deliver. And we can't get everything right and know everything at the point at which we're doing budget proposals. So we just created a bit of capacity to do that. The other reserve, though, is the reserve that I talked about being the business change reserve. And fundamentally, that is the positive investment on doing change for better outcomes that won't necessarily deliver a saving. It's also about investing in our staff, making sure our staff are able to transition to the new world that requires us to be changing constantly, and making sure we've given that appropriate support. So with the senior management restructure, we want to make sure that all our managers across the organisation have the right skills to be able to deliver at the pace and the ambition of what we are doing in actually approving this budget. You've seen the investment figures. We've talked about over £250 million of capital investment over 5 years. That takes a lot of skill to be able to deliver that, and that's why we want to make sure our staff have the right skills and availability to do that. There is also the little challenging side of occasionally we are in restructures going to be saying goodbye to some of our workforce and making sure we have the right skills we need, and that will help cover off some of that as well. But it's not making more reserves for no known reason, Councillor Osborne. It's a very specific earmark reserve for a purpose of which we're allowed to set aside money.
Yeah, thanks. That explains it. I suppose I was slightly confused by the term reserve. It sounds like sort of putting money away not to be spent, but yeah.
No, it will, yeah.
Can I just pick up though about the point about, you know, the fact that we seem to be in a position where we're having to discuss a budget, and this has come up a couple of times in relation to the already in relation to, you know, design of services in Nikki's answer earlier, and the response to the question about parking charges. We seem to be in a position where we're having to vote on a budget where we don't necessarily know what all of the implications are, and I'm just wondering whether there will be further detail by the time that full council is expected to vote on this later in February.
So I think I just want to make it clear we're taking the principles, and there's always a timing issue around where you go out for more detailed consultation on specific issues, because if there isn't the political desire to take that forward, then it would be inappropriate for us to start a consultation process around that. So timing is always a challenge, but I think the principles of what we're trying to do are quite clear, and therefore we've got assumptions behind that. What might change through doing detailed consultation is the detail behind that, but as I say, it's always important that we listen to the consultation and we have the flexibility to be able to adapt if needed. So I don't think we're in a position where you're approving something that you can't understand in principle. What you just can't see in some of it is the finer detail of exactly what the scheme will mean.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Giles next, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just to praise my questions, fantastic that we've got a balanced budget without the need to draw down on reserves or make significant cuts to frontline services. That really illustrates how prudently our finances have been managed by our officers, and that's excellent. However, the medium-term financial strategy does illustrate the incredibly difficult decisions we're going to have to take in the years ahead if the government doesn't change course in terms of its funding of local government. However, I'm sorry to go away from a positive, but to focus in on an area of concern, and that is what Councillor Carlo raised about the potential for 2 to 3 community centres to possibly be sold or long leased for commercial purposes. It would be good to have some further clarity as regards whether there'll be any. Obviously, you've already mentioned local area consultation of residents on any such decisions, but it would also be good to have some guarantee of elected member say on this as well. I mean, if we were to go ahead and decide to sell or long lease a community centre, would that go to full council? Would that go to cabinet? Or by approving this budget, would we be delegating that authority to officers to do without elected member input? Appreciate that obviously very difficult decisions are going to have to be taken in the years to come because of the government austerity, but it would be good to know. I think as elected members, we need to be making those most difficult decisions, those most controversial decisions. I don't think I'd be concerned about them, such significant decisions just being delegated to officers. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Giles. As Annabelle has just taken you through, you're approving the principles of the budget here, and that then there are a set of decisions that obviously will be delegated to Cabinet to establish. So that's the kind of way that flows through.
So just to confirm, if we were to sell or long lease a community centre, that would go to Cabinet for approval rather than full council?
Yeah, I'd have to check on that around the kind of delegation levels.
Okay, I mean, to be honest, I do really think that should go to full council, such a difficult decision as that. Obviously, difficult decisions are going to have to be made. I think our communities are going to expect us as their representatives to make those decisions, really. But yeah, that's my opinion.
So in normal circumstances, that would be a cabinet decision. So that's where that delegation will sit.
Can I bring in at this point the leader and chair of cabinet, who is indicating, Councillor Waters?
Thanks very much, James. And I think, Adam, to respond to your concerns, I mean, what would sit behind a decision that would come to cabinet would be a report which would reflect the views of elected members, and particularly those elected members who would be representing areas where there would be, say, some repurposing of community centres, as well as consultation. So that's an assurance that it's not going to be a decision which is, as it were, delegated to cabinet without that consultation and that range of views being given an opportunity to be registered.
Thank you for that answer. Let's move on. Councillor Ryan, please.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I'd like to congratulate the budget team on their prudence, the fact that they have been planning ahead. We are in a position where we do have underspends as a council at very, very difficult times, and I think that should be noted and that should be congratulated upon. One thing that does concern me is future restructuring. It was mentioned by Annabelle a little while ago, restructuring in quotes, and which could mean, I suspect, changes of people's work patterns and perhaps job losses. I wonder how close we are to this restructuring. I know it depends on what happens in the budget coming up in March as far as the government's concerned, but how close are we to what's called, in quotes, a restructuring at the council?
Thank you. Can I bring in the Chief Exec at this point, please?
So the council is already going through a restructuring. I've restructured the senior management team, and that restructuring is happening at the moment, and a number of posts are changing, so reducing the number of directors, increasing the number of heads of service, reducing the number of directorates we've got at the council down from 4 to 3, and that senior management structure will come into effect in April. We'll then be looking at how we can break down silos and join up services across teams. So this isn't about cuts, this is about how we can deliver better services and put our residents, our customers at the centre of that, so that how we are structured as a council makes sense for our residents rather than something which suits us as an organisation. Now, one of the things that we will be investing in is increased digital technology, because, you know, certainly through the pandemic, we've all got used to doing things digitally, and many of our residents feel comfortable doing that, and it's more convenient for them, and that will lead to savings in the back office. Now, what we will always do is look at vacancies. So a number of teams across the organisation hold vacancies, and we would remove any vacancies first. We'd also then look at redeploying staff into other areas. So we have a process of staff redeployment, and those would be the processes and the steps we'd go through before looking at any staff reductions. But just to reassure you, although we are going through this process, this is not about, you know, reducing staff. This is primarily about restructuring the council and the services we provide so that they're more joined up. And we do go through those steps before any staff reductions are made. But I guess, you know, I can't give any guarantees that there won't be staff reductions in future, because in future years after next year's budget, what the assumptions are showing is that we have to make another £3 million savings each year. And at the moment, you know, the funding we get from government isn't sufficient. So unless government comes in at the budget or the future spending review with a properly funded system for local government, I'm afraid, you know, we're going to be in this world every year where we have to look at savings and we have to look at other options for reducing income. So that's the process we're going through, but it's not easy.
So, in summary, the way the council operates at the moment is going to change in wholesale terms. Is that right, Stephen?
No, I mean, this is about, as I say, looking at bringing teams together and making sure they're joined up, and it's intended to be a benefit. So we've got a revenues and benefits team, we've got housing options teams, and we want to make sure that those teams are working together so that we are, you know, in terms of managing debt and that kind of thing, we're joined up in our approach. So this is about redesigning services to make them better for our residents. And so I see this as a positive thing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I haven't seen any other members indicate at this stage. Does anyone else have any questions they wish to ask on the general fund item? No? Okay. Well, let's move on. Any discussion on the general fund item that we want to have? We've had a bit of backwards and forwards over some of the issues, but anyone wish to say anything at this stage? So I hadn't actually picked up any specific recommendations for the general fund, which is, yeah, I'm not saying we have to have recommendations, although that did prompt Councillor Carlo to raise your hand. Councillor Carlo, please.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, Louise, in her response to me, mentioned that the council had produced some assumptions in relation to possible commercial let or sale of community centres, and it will be very helpful for ward councillors to be circulated with those assumptions. I personally at this stage would like to see this option dropped altogether, because it is very controversial, as Adam is saying, and it's going to have big implications for the communities. And it really, the amount of money that's proposed to raise, £11,000 possibly per community centre over a year, is really a pittance. And I'm sure we can find that income from other savings. In fact, I'm going to suggest two savings later on in the budget.
Thank you, Councillor Carlo. Bring in Councillor Waters at this stage, please.
I think it's important to acknowledge the status of these recommendations. They are to be explored, and I think the overarching principle of being able to generate income rather than cut services is one that I know the public have agreed with when we proposed this is an approach to addressing the budget issues that we currently face in the public consultation. And so I think as has been said before, you know, by officers, we're looking to explore a range of possible options that will generate an income to enable us to balance the budget, protect services. And we do need to test those propositions out. So it is not necessarily a given that the options, should we choose them, around community centres will be, you know, greeted with dismay. People will have the opportunity to look at those issues in the round. And I suppose the other point I would make is this, that, you know, we're not, because we've been successful in protecting services for the coming year, there's no guarantee that that will be the case going forward. That, frankly, is in the hands of government, the budget that they'll be putting forward in March, but then various local government related settlements through the course of the year. And so, you know, one does one's best to sort of see what that situation looks like. But it's been alluded to, and I think Councillor Giles alluded to it, looking at the medium-term financial strategy, the medium-term financial position, there are some really challenging issues there in terms of the amounts of money we have to identify to be able to deliver a balanced budget at a very sort of stressed time in terms of the state of the economy and so on. So it's important that we put these options on the table, we test them out, we explore them, but we keep in mind that longer term situation which we face, and also the need to make sure that we deliver the services that people particularly need at this time. So there will be more debate about these choices, inevitably there will be, but I think it's right that they are in this set of budget proposals to be tested out going forward.
Thank you, Councillor Waters. Do any other members have anything they wish to say on the general fund item at the moment? Councillor Thomas.
Thank you. I'm just thinking that in general, it's very difficult for people to accept change. Obviously, going back to the changes with the car parking possibility, but at this moment in time, I do think it's better to try and protect the essential services, and even if the amounts in themselves from the different options may be small, you know, as a whole added up, it's obviously more money than no money.
Okay. Thank you for that. Any other comments at this stage? We have a what I think probably could be described as a proposal, a recommendation from Councillor Carlo, which is to provide members with the assumptions for the community centre proposals. Councillor Carlo, did I sort of get that? Is that correct in essence? Yeah. So a steer from the committee around the sort of practicalities, or Louise, did you wish to say something on that?
Yes, I just wanted to make clear that I think what I said was that our assumption was prudent, rather than we have a set of assumptions. That work is still to be done in detail.
So in essence, at the moment, there is nothing that could be provided to members which has any sort of background on giving some more detail on these proposals.
Not prior to budget, no.
Not prior to budget. Okay, thank you. Councillor Ryan.
Thank you, Chair. As we've got nothing to go on there, I can't see how we can actually share the assumptions around the committee. So I think this one's a bit of a no-goer.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, then, if there's nothing else, I'm proposing that we move on to section 3, which is the housing revenue account. Okay, section 3 then, housing revenue account. Councillor Osborne, you'd indicated that you had a question on that.
Yes, thank you. The question is about retrofitting and you know, adapting housing for the climate emergency. So as I understand it, you know, we've allocated 15 million of the surplus from the HRA account to building new council housing, which I fully support as a principle. And then there's obviously reserves for upgrades to existing housing stock. And I'm wondering whether the upgrades to existing housing stock is sufficient, basically. Because, I mean, the government current budget for retrofitting is about 3.5 billion or 3.8 billion. And the estimated cost of retrofitting to actually meet carbon reduction targets is something about 3 billion every year for the next decade, next 12 years, I think. So, I mean, what Brighton and Hove have done is they've set aside some of their HRA surplus as a reserve specifically for retrofitting and energy efficiency measures on existing housing stock. Now, I understand that we want to be building new council housing with our surplus, which again, as I say, I fully support. However, is there scope to set aside more money for retrofitting, especially as it's likely that there's going to be more money coming down the line as a result of COP26 later this year. And so there might be opportunities to leverage funding, particularly if we're working in partnership with potentially other local authorities or with housing associations.
Lee, can I bring you in on that one, please?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, what I would say is there's always scope, but it is about balancing. They're not competing needs necessarily, but I mean, I think, you know, the four goals, if you like, of the HRA strategy that we set last year about meeting need, making sure that the existing stock we have remains fit for purpose, making sure the management of that stock in terms of allocations and everything else is, so that might include some remodeling. So we need to do some work about housing need in the future, because we've got a lot of flats. Is that what people are going to want in 20 years' time? And of course, there's the other strand, the fourth strand then, which is about the neighbourhood. So the HRA capital strategy is balanced across those four things, and I think, you know, the retrofitting, and certainly the government have come out with new pieces of consultation where we clearly need to look at that and make sure we get that balance right. I mean, Sean is very experienced at doing HRA business strategies with competing demands all the time, really. So I would say there's always going to be scope. Clearly, in the capital programme as we have it now, one of the things we need to do is to make sure that, you know, that we've got much better energy efficient properties, because a lot of stock is really old. So even just on that basis, it's you know, a big challenge. But also because they're cheaper to run for tenants. So it's also an anti-poverty measure, if you like. You know, so yeah, very broadly, there's always scope, and I think these conversations are ones that we will have not just every year, but in terms of setting that 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 year strategy long after I'm no longer here, let alone anything else. So yeah, and we'd welcome those observations and conversations with you, Councillor, as we would with all councillors, as indeed tenants. So and you're right, and I know we've secured some money recently from some government pots to do some work on solar panels, as we have in the past with the thermodynamic water systems. So we're alive to all of those opportunities, and as you know, like Richard Wilson himself is really right at the cutting edge of a lot of the work nationally on that as well. So I'm usually quite beholden to him on some of those conversations. So very short answer, yes. Welcome those conversations.
Thank you for that. Councillor Osborne, do you have a follow-up?
I mean, I suppose a follow-up is what would those conversations look like? How can that be taken forward?
If Councillor Harris rather has a regular meeting with the shadow member, I believe it's Councillor Neil. Certainly we can agenda it there, and we can explore exactly what the detail might look like on that in terms of how we do the capital programme for next year, and any other issues that you want as a group there as well, and that includes Councillor Wright as well. That's, you know, that's a good avenue, that is, to at least start to scope those conversations out.
Okay.
Thank you. Any other questions? Councillor Carlo.
Ask a question of Lee on the same subject, please. Yep. So Lee, last year, one of the scrutiny recommendations was to investigate use of the housing revenue account money towards future, towards carbon future proofing, and obviously this hasn't happened. And you mentioned the need for ongoing conversations around this topic. But I wondered generally, what are the City Council's ambitions for the future for carbon retrofitting? What vision does the council have in mind? What is it working towards, or doesn't it actually have a vision in terms of retrofitting its large set of assets? Please.
I wouldn't say that we've got fully worked plans on that. What I would say is that, you know, part of the insourcing of our asset management capabilities will make those conversations and that strategy a lot easier. Last year we did adopt an HOA strategy in November 19. It was the first time we've done that tries to see things in the round. So I think previously it probably has just been predicated on stock condition rather than any of those wider ambitions we might have, not just on that, but also about, you know, social investment and the things that have been mentioned earlier on. So, I mean, I think you're right. Something did get in the way this year to have possibly some of those wider conversations that have obviously sidetracked us in terms of being able to, you know, really work through some of that. But, you know, that is certainly is a plan that we need to have over the next year to start to balance out, to say over the 60-year period, exactly what we can afford in terms of meeting housing need, making sure that our neighbourhoods are good and our stock is fit for the future. That includes its, you know, carbon neutrality, or, you know, the way that it creates a carbon footprint. So, you know, something has got in the way this year, Councillor, but the door is open for those conversations for 22 onwards on this and a range of issues.
Thank you. I'm just going to bring in Graham Nelson, then Councillor Osborne I know has a follow-up to this question, and then Councillor Ryan.
Can I just add to that answer that Lee gave, it specifically in relation to the housing stock? Because clearly Council set out quite an ambitious agenda in its environmental strategy as terms of how it's going to deliver this ambition to be a carbon neutral council effectively by 2030. There's clearly an action plan in place about the measures that we're going to do in the short term to try and help us on that journey. And over the coming years, clearly we do need to put shape to that to say how we're going to complete that journey, whether we're going to do things like offsetting or whether we can entirely deliver it through energy efficiency measures or other things that we attach to our portfolio. We're looking quite ambitiously, not only at the standard that which we build new homes to and what environmental standards they come in at, it's retrofitting existing housing stock, and of course we've got quite a significant operational stock and commercial assets, and it's across that entire range of assets that we look, and we have been quite successful in levering in some government funds through particularly the Salix fund, both grant funding and loan funding that comes through and is invested in our asset portfolio across the piece. So we're active on a number of fronts, and certainly I think one of our anticipations for next year is on the back of the COP21 conference. We are expecting an increased level of announcements of government funding that come in this space to try and encourage not only housing authorities but local authorities generally to invest in this area, and we hope to be well placed to take advantage of any of those opportunities that arise, and certainly through the resourcing we put into our environmental strategy and how that uses to be funding specialist staff within MPS Norwich to take forward to design up and to deliver schemes like that. We do have a mechanism in place that means we're plugged into those conversations at government and have been rather more successful than many other councils at accessing those sources of money when they become available.
Before I bring in Councillor Osborne, Councillor Graham, I've noted your hand raised. Councillor Osborne.
Thank you. Yes, and it's evident, I think, from what the answers so far that, you know, this is something that the council wants to do, but we don't have necessarily a plan on how to do it. And retrofitting is a complex area where there'll be different solutions for different kinds of properties, and also I think different players can be involved. So it's a big area for jobs, one of the biggest areas for jobs in the green economy. And, you know, I know that the local enterprise partnership has been involved with trying to get catapult funding for decarbonisation of housing training academy And so we may want to be looking at how we can use those people who are being trained up in the city, and make sure that they're then able to contribute to the council's objectives, and looking towards Brighton and Hove, where they've said that as I said, they've set aside a reserve for retrofitting, and they're planning to bring a report later this year on how they're actually going to achieve that. And Bristol, through their City Leap programme, have basically sought out partners from private sector and other public sector bodies who can partner with them and identify ways of retrofitting housing on a wider scale, not just social housing, but also private sector. And through the City 2040 vision that Norwich has, the Business Climate Leaders Group, potentially the Good Economy Commission, we have the infrastructure to set up a more partnership-based approach to the wider retrofitting programme, and I'd hope that that's something that we can take forward.
Yeah, sorry, if I may, absolutely, and I think that's reflected in that change I think that we've made recently to move away from just something that's about property condition. Until very recently, that's what the capital programme, the HRA strategy, the HRA business plan was predicated in, solely stock condition. I think we've managed to shift that terrain now to start to look at those wider kind of issues, but also even the social issues, say the social investment, those are big, and they demand that partnership approach. So it isn't just some surveyors in City Hall that are going to make those decisions. They are going to be much wider conversations with partners and as you say, other players in that space. So yeah, thank you for those observations as well.
Thank you. Councillor Waters, did I see that you wish to come in with a...
Yes, just one thing. I'm not comfortable with this this narrative of a lack of strategy, and I think actually the comments that Councillor Osborne has made tell a different story, that actually there is a strategy. It is embracing wide network of partnerships, but the point that Graham made about the COP26, where we're expecting a flow of money to improve the investment in this area is particularly important. And I guess Councillor Osborne, Councillor Culler will remember a rather comprehensive motion we passed on environmental strategy, which acknowledged as one of the recommendations the crucial role that central government plays in making sure that we can achieve a significant advance in the areas that we're discussing at the moment. And if we're talking about, for example, retrofitting the private sector, 40% of the housing in the private rented sector in Norwich is of a poor standard, and certainly a poor standard in relation to the quality of housing that the City Council provides. And that's just one city, and there are hundreds of billions of pounds of expenditure that would need to go into dealing with retrofitting in the private sector alone. So I think it's important to acknowledge that the council, and I think it's reflected in our strategies, I think it's reflected in the funding that is embedded in, among other things, the housing revenue count and the capital programme, is making significant headway in this in a very ambitious way. I'm expecting, I have to say, just as a footnote, to have many references to Brighton and Hove Council, since they've just acquired a minority Green administration. So we'll hear more from them, I'm sure.
Thank you. Councillor Ryan, you were next with a question.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, I don't think anybody would doubt that retrofitting and new builds will go hand in hand when we finally get round to our zero carbon future. But I would caution against ring fencing money for retrofits at this stage, simply because the government hasn't told us what they're going to do as far as spending money is concerned. The government's got very ambitious plans for a zero carbon future, but when it comes to telling us exactly where the money is going to come from, how much is going to be available, they've made not an ounce of information available to us. So I'd caution against rushing into ring fencing various pots for this. The government says it's going to do big things. Well, let's wait and see to find out exactly what it's going to do, because sometimes governments don't always stick to what they say.
Thank you. Councillor Graham, next please with a question.
Thank you. On a related note, there's quite a few references to replacing boilers. And while we're talking about low carbon options, I'd like to make sure that in each case we're replacing, our boiler replacements are future proofed. And that might mean putting money in from invest to save if it makes them more expensive than what we absolutely need to spend right now. It might mean something else. But when I read replacing oil boilers at Normandy Tower, I was looking for what are we replacing them with? And I'd like to know that it isn't oil, but maybe that's not a detail for this meeting. But in each case, I think, replacing boilers with the most, with the least amount of carbon is absolutely essential. And we should put some money into that. And I'd also like to rule out offsetting for most purposes. It should be absolutely the bottom of the hierarchy of how we should do things, because it doesn't actually save any carbon. It gets other people to do it somewhere else, and sometimes at the cost of land grabbing, sometimes at various other social costs. So if we were going to go down an offsetting route, it would need a huge amount of scrutiny, because there are some decent schemes and there's some absolutely awful ones.
Would you like me to respond to that point? I mean, I'm not sure as it's a budget meeting whether you want to drill down into the detail of the individual proposals for boiler replacements in particular places, but can I just offer some degree of assurance as those improvements come forward, boiler replacements or other energy efficiency measures that are introduced. We obviously have an environmental strategy team. They are engaged in that process. They look and they try and, it varies each circumstance. We've got to look at the costs of doing these things. You've got to look at the environmental benefits, but we look to use that expertise that we have to ensure that each of these investments we make is the best from a number of fronts, including the environmental angle. So there are a number of proposals to look at various, reboilering of a number of premises, and each one of those is looked at to check that, the environmental credentials of what we are doing. So that is looked at as part of the process, and indeed informs, because a number of these boilers are energy inefficient, is why they have been targeted in the replacement programme in the first place, to address issues such as fuel poverty. And the other points you make more around the carbon offsetting. We adopted our environmental strategy in the summer of last year. We're monitoring the action plan associated with us on a regular basis, and we'll report back through both SEEP and Cabinet in due course any reviews that are needed to that strategy. It doesn't refer or commit us, well, it doesn't commit us in any way to offsetting. It sets that target. We need to flush out how we're going to hit that target of delivering a carbon neutral council by 2030. We've got an action plan to carry on our good work of specifically reducing our carbon footprint that we've progressively delivered since 2007 when we started monitoring our carbon footprint, but we aren't committed to using offsetting. All we at the moment is we have identified that it becomes possible to do it through one way or another through that route, and that's part of our toolkit we may choose to decide to use.
Thank you. Any other questions relating to the HRA budget at this stage, please? Councillor Osborne, then Councillor Giles.
Thank you. Yes, final point, because I do want to move on other things, but just to respond to Councillor Waters, I think it's clear from what officers have said that what Graham's just said that we do need to flesh out how we're going to achieve that carbon neutral target. And it's not a criticism; it's a suggestion that we may want to that more work needs to be done in developing that partnership approach so that we're in a position to use the money that may be coming down the line from government, so that we're in a position to leverage other private sector and other public sector funding. And I referenced Brighton and Hove as an example because that's a very recent example, just earlier this week or last week, that they decided to set up a retrofitting strategy. But as I mentioned earlier, Bristol has done the same. Kirklees have done the same a few years ago, in fact. And so my suggestion is that we actually look at setting up a retrofitting strategy to work out how we're going to do that.
Thank you, Councillor Osborne. Councillor Giles.
Thanks, Chair. I just want to come in on this section of the report because while significant challenges have obviously been identified, I think there's actually a lot to be excited about, a lot to be proud about in this section of the report in particular. Obviously, we face enormous challenges with regards to the general fund revenue budget in the medium term, but actually the future is pretty bright for the HRA compared to many places around the country. And while it's rather specific, I hadn't seen reference before reading this report to possible social housing developments in the Aylwin Hall and Northumberland Street sites. And I just wondered whether Graham or Lee could come in. I appreciate it's obviously at a very high level, early stage at this moment in time, but just briefly set out what may be possible on those sites.
Thank you.
From a budget perspective, I think it's important that as a council we have sufficient funds available that if sites become derelict, that we can tackle that, because not only is that sort of land that is going to waste within the city that could be used to house people, it frequently blights communities, gives rise to antisocial behaviour and creates a number of problems in our communities that the best way of addressing is securing productive use of that land. Doesn't necessarily have to be social housing, and indeed some of what we've gone through, I mean, members will be well aware that this year we have compulsorily purchased the King's Arms site that's been derelict for some time in Mile Cross, the site, I should say the former King's Arms site, showing my age slightly there, and that's going to be developed for social housing, which should commence later this year, the construction of that. I can't give you too much about detail in this forum, particularly about the ongoing work in relation to other sites, because simply the process that we go through in relation to those means that it is designed to give the owners of those sites opportunities to develop themselves, because by definition, if you're using powers like compulsory purchase, it's from the court's perspective an infringement on people's liberties, and effectively you would only use them as a last resort. So there's a defined process behind them, but it's important that we have the monies available within the housing revenue accounts to do that sort of work if we're serious about removing that blight from our community. And I'll draw people's attention also to the Towns Fund, where through through our town investment plan that went through Cabinet last year, we also got further monies in that we will be able to try and use to deliver those sort of objectives on sites through the revolving fund that was part of the bid that we put in, which was successful in getting part of the 25 million programme we've been offered from government.
Thank you for that answer, Graham. Talk about showing your age. I think it's common in Norwich to navigate by former pub sites. The Earl of Leicester, it hasn't been there for 14 years now, but it's always the Earl of Leicester. Anyway, that question from Councillor Giles sort of took us into section 4 a little bit in terms of assets. I just wondered, does anyone else have anything they wish to say on the housing revenue account? I didn't really pick out any potential recommendations in the questioning. So is there anything else on the HRA before we then move on to the asset management strategy? The capital strategy, I should say, section 4.
I mean, I suppose not necessarily directly a budget related recommendation, but I think there is work to do on retrofitting strategy or energy efficiency strategy.
I'm not sure whether that would sit as something that we could put in today, but definitely, it's been heard, no doubt, and could be considered as part of future proposals. Shall we move on to section 4 then, capital strategy? Councillor Osborne, I think you'd indicated you had a question on that.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, my question is about the sources of capital finance. I think it's page 118 to 124. Is it? Yeah, 119 to 124. Sorry, Appendix 4C, and one of the lists the potential sources of capital finance, and it doesn't mention community municipal investment bonds, which is something that we have raised in the past and has obviously been discussed in the past. And it was at the time, I think, Annabelle, and I know that it was said that the council would prefer to use Pwlb lending. However, it is still an option as a source of funding. It's increasingly commonplace among other local authorities, so it's now referenced in guides on green financing for local authorities from the Local Government Association and from the UK 100 group of local authorities on ambitious on climate change. And of course, it doesn't necessarily just apply to green financing. However, it's a good source of community sort of local finance that can contribute to community wealth building as well. So I just asked that could be included as a potential source of capital finance to be considered.
Yes, so Councillor Osborne, as we discussed, it is an option for us, but what we've articulated here is the different type of funding sources within the strategy that we're proposing. So there isn't actually a scheme within there which would use that as an option. But as we discussed previously, the reason why we said Pwlb is it's actually cheaper for us to utilise that because we're at historically low interest rates. That doesn't mean in future that actually that might be a different option for us going forward. But at the moment, what we've got here is what is actually funding our capital programme. But there is always that option to include it as a principle, something we'll look at in future. That's not a problem. But the reality is there's no scheme within here at the moment that would be funded by that source.
Councillor Osborne.
I appreciate that. I suppose my understanding is that we would be looking at potentially identifying projects that could be funded through that. So if we find a project that could be funded through that and that may come forward in the coming year, then it could be used. So
yes, and as you'll be aware, there's a requirement for us to come back to council for any variation to the capital programme, and at that point we would obviously change the strategy to acknowledge the fact that we'd be using a different type of funding source. So Councillor Osborne, I hope you accept there is that option to come. We would always come back to council with such a change. So
okay, good. Thank you for that. Any other questions on capital strategy? Councillor Carlo.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I wanted to just touch on the council's portfolio of assets. The portfolio is very large and it requires a £21 million maintenance backlog at the moment. If some of the assets were sold, the receipts could be used to build more council houses, for example. And the council hasn't really got any closer to undertaking a full review. So I'm wondering whether this year, in fact, the review is going to be carried out. And in relation to the budget this year, I want to query 2 or 3, in fact, specific proposals in the budget and to find out whether in fact they could be sold on the open market rather than spend on refurbishing them. 3 are on page 116, and there's 38 Exchange Street, which is shop refurbishment at 61,000. 85 to 91 Burr Street, which is a shop, and there it requires re-roofing works. And there's 2 Old Meeting House Alley, which requires £12,000 worth of work. It may be that these buildings bring a good return, but it's obviously we would need more information about that. But they will just flag up really whether some of the assets, whether the council needs to carry on retaining them. I also just want to ask, please, whether the new assets purchased, because the Public Works Local Board, councils are going to be able to continue borrowing money for local purchases, whether they include repair and maintenance costs, whether these are built into the budgets and into assumptions about net income, please. Thank you.
So as you mentioned, Councillor Carlo, we do have looking forward an asset management review that we're going to be undertaking. That's, you know, Graham and Lou might want to talk about that further, but fundamentally that will cover both our commercial elements of our asset portfolio and the general fund assets, as well as looking at our housing assets. So fundamentally though, what it was important for us to do for this budget is to make sure the short-term needs that we knew about fundamentally could be addressed. And the elements that you've talked about, those specific properties, we know we've got some short-term questions that we might need to address in the next financial year. So it's only appropriate that we set aside money to do that. But it may be that once the asset review starts, that we say actually that particular asset now will not have that 50,000 spent on it. We will hold it because actually we're going to take a different direction of travel with it. But the fundamental, we had to balance between the short-term known needs against our future strategic approach, and we needed to give ourselves time to do that appropriately. So that's why we're going to invest time next year to do a full asset management review, of which I've referenced in the report. In relation to the commercial property portfolio, yes, going forward, the Pwlb has changed and we won't be able to invest in the way we had done previously, but it doesn't stop us doing regeneration work in our local area, as you've described. What we are still able to do, though, is ensure that we keep the existing assets that we own fit for purpose, and therefore, if there was a need in future to invest in that portfolio to ensure that we were getting the best financial return and we could ensure we got the tenancy at the appropriate rates, we can do that. So there's nothing preventing us from looking after the stock we've already got. There's no requirement for us to sell any assets we've got, and the reality is it was a very good, positive outcome for us as a city that actually the revenue that we are retaining in those assets are actually supporting us and protecting frontline services. So we have had to take a different direction of travel just because central government are taking a different approach on Pwlb, but the reality is that we do have a portfolio that we will continue to be able to look after. I don't know, Graham, whether you wanted to say anything else on the asset management review.
I think you've largely covered it. I mean, we clearly have an asset management strategy that is some years old now and is in need of refresh. That refresh started in terms of the internal working groups that are there to start making sure everybody in the council is plugged into the right course of action and is going to come back through the cabinet and committee structure later in this calendar year, effectively, for formal endorsement, so members will get a chance to input through that process. In terms of that strategy, we're always treading this balance in relation to individual assets of whether we ought to sell them in terms of generating a capital receipt and what that capital receipt does for our medium-term financial strategy, as opposed to whether we hold them in terms of and generating the ongoing revenue. You're only seeing one side of the picture in terms of the capital expense. We do go through a process when we're considering significant investment investments as that, some of which we're obligated to make for health and safety reasons or other reasons as a responsible landlord. We do go through an asset review approach effectively to satisfy ourselves that, you know, investment is still justified because of the rate of rental returns you're either going to get or you expect. There's some element of risk around that. There inevitably is when it comes to property, but there is that procedure that we've gone through before we decide to spend that whatever that money is to invest that property. And you know, it can change over time, but we have a defined asset review process that we go through when we're considering such expenditure.
Thank you for that. Councillor Carlo, did you have a follow-up to that answer at all?
No, that's very helpful. Thank you very much. I have got one further thing that I wanted to flag up though on this list, and that is the Norwich Yacht Station. I looked back and saw that it was discussed in the Evening News, I think, in 2011, when the council then was looking at investing or paying for maintenance. And it's down this time again to replace some timbers at the cost of £8,000. I'm just interested to, probably details aren't available now, but interested to understand the economic return to financial return to the city of the yacht station. Obviously having the yacht station is beneficial for the city, but I wondered about actually owning the yacht station and charging a fee. So we get an income from it, but we're actually not responsible for maintenance.
I think instead of trying to answer that question here, I'd feel more comfortable if I could speak to colleagues and find the appropriate answer to it. I know I know quite a lot about the Norwich Yacht Station in terms of how we go about managing it in terms of the lease and everything else, but I'm not across the detail of that particular proposal. I know it's changed a lot since 2011 in terms of how it's managed from what it was, because actually there's quite significant liabilities in relation to the yacht station, and you know, it covers its costs in terms of ongoing stuff. It's that longer term legacy is the issue with the yacht station. But of course, through the River Wentham strategy, hopefully that sets out a vision which sees far more use of the river for a variety of things, and that would be all good to the financial well-being of the yacht station. But clearly it's really quite important for the city to make the most of the river as an asset in it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Osborne and then Councillor Giles.
Thank you. Yes, just picking up on the asset review. I think this is also part of section 5 as well. It sort of straddles both. But I noticed in a report on community wealth building that was done for Lewes District Council by the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, they talk about reviewing all potential asset disposals through a community wealth building lens. So that may be how we dispose of the assets, or whether they can also be retained or transferred to the community in other ways that would support that sort of principle of using the council as an anchor institution to support community wealth building. I know that's something that council's considering, but I just want to flag that up. My other question is about collaboration with other local authorities and on the capital programme. So I noticed that the capital grants are more likely to be given to authorities when they collaborate with other public bodies. And I think that we can also collaborate with other local authorities to use Pwlb funding and then invest it outside of the local area if we want to. Am I correct in thinking that? And so I suppose my question is about the approach to collaborating with other local authorities.
So, Councillor Osborne, we haven't in this budget proposal looked at doing any collaboration with any other local authorities. So I can't answer the detail option there about Pwlb and therefore investing outside of the area. But sorry, I just saw Alan's hand go up there. Do you want to?
I'll wait for the chair to call me.
All right, apologies. So I think it's important, though, that we are focusing on the proposals in front of us. In relation to sort of collaborating with other organisations, though, that is very much how, as Graham mentioned earlier, we've managed to pull in the Towns Fund money. The reality is we were working with other organisations, whether it's the City College and other partners, and to have £25 million investment into the city that is grant funded is a very, very positive position to be in. And obviously Graham can talk more about that, but that's a fantastic outcome that we can see coming through on this budget paper.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I don't think I need more on that. I just wanted to know what that was referring to, and yeah, that helps. Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Waters, can I bring you in, please?
Only to say one of the other areas of collaboration over a long period of time, of course, has been the Greater Norwich partnership, where we pool our SIL, Community Infrastructure Levy, and we have done particularly well out of that arrangement. So like the proverbial stick of rock, collaboration cuts through it in the relationship that the council has with a whole range of different partners.
Thank you. Councillor Giles.
Thank you, Chair. My question was actually relating to the Towns Fund. Congratulations to the officers who put in so much time and effort to this. I'm sure a major concern coming out of this pandemic will be jobs in the city and across the country, and the securing of this funding is really welcome. Just with regards to the specific projects for the potential Advanced Construction Engineering Centre and a Digitech factory, I wondered if Graham could give us a bit more detail on them, because I'm sure that that they sound like very positive initiatives, so I appreciate that they are at an early stage at this moment in time.
I could do. I'm somewhat reluctant to go into a huge amount of detail. Obviously, we took a paper through Cabinet in January detailing where we are in terms of the town investment plan, having just received the confirmation of the funding and the agreement of the heads of terms. We're now going through the process of preparing up the detailed business cases that need to go into government to effectively draw down the funding of it. Both of the things that you specifically mentioned in terms of the Digitech factory and the Advanced Construction and Engineering Centre, the lead authority for the delivery of those proposals is in fact City College. So I think if you're interested in knowing more about precisely what they are going to achieve, might be worth a conversation with them and to bring that in so they can explain them to yourself. Certainly in terms of one of those, which is the Digitech factory, is currently being built at the moment. It's on site, is being delivered, and the funding agreed that is being accelerated through the business place is through the business case that we've just preparing and going through the process of submitting, is ensuring that that project can be fully delivered and deliver all the benefits. And it's clearly around far better equipping principally local but not exclusive to Norwich, because as you know, City College draws in people from quite a diverse background and geographical area. It's about better equipping those with digital skills so they can better serve the employers and themselves be more attractive in the job market and having just read the detailed business case for it today, there's a very impressive story to tell about how that sort of investment can assist in addressing some of the embedded issues of deprivation and give people a way out of that deprivation in a very positive way, which obviously that's the City College's sort of area of expertise. And there's something similar in terms of the Advanced Construction and Engineering Centre, which is a project that is a little further off realisation, but actually in terms of probably numbers of people, it can help into the job market and equip them to compete in the construction sector with the relevant skills. It's possibly, I think is probably more ambitious. It's certainly larger, got larger student numbers than the Digitech factory, and they're both very, significantly beneficial projects for the wider Norwich area, I would suggest. But yes, I don't know. I can't really say too much more about the detail of the proposals at this moment.
No, thank you, Graham. That's very promising.
Thank you for that. Any other questions on the capital strategy at the moment? Okay. Does anyone wish to say anything in the form of a discussion on this with a view to perhaps coming to a recommendation? None of the questions have suggested to me that we're likely to go down to have any specific recommendations. No? Okay, thank you. It'd just be helpful to, I'm conscious of structuring the rest of the meeting and fitting in a comfort break if necessary, just to get a steer from committee members. Just thumbs up will do. Who is going to ask any questions on item 5, non-financial commercial investment? Councillor, yeah, got a couple on that. And 6, treasury management. Are we going to have any more questions on that? So we had sort of some in section 1. Okay, well, let's, on that basis, let's crack on then with number 5, item 5, non-financial commercial investments. Councillor Manning, I saw you indicate first there. So do you want to ask your question on that, please?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Can I just check that I'm heard? I've got a new laptop from work, which is temperamental.
Yep.
Great, thank you. Yeah, my question is fairly brief, I think. It's on the Pwlb. It's been touched on in the last section, but I was sat here dutifully waiting for section 5 before I asked it, but I'll ask it anyway. But I think it's still relevant. I remember a scrutiny meeting 2 or 3 years ago when we talked about the Pwlb and the advantage we were taking of it. And I think advantage is probably the right word, because it seemed that at the time we could ring up and make an oral case for an investment we wanted to make, and then watch our bank account fill with gold. And it's not that way anymore. I think the government has withdrawn the scheme in fright at the exposure that some authorities, ourselves not included, were creating for themselves to the sort of debt was being incurred. And I think the government must have taken the view that it's not a great way now to increase debt across councils, and the facility has been withdrawn or replaced with something a bit different, where, as I understand it, instead of the magic phone call, you now have to make a case for some sort of 3-year application of the funds you want to borrow. Given that we're only having 1-year settlements from central government and prevailing circumstances generally, I just wondered what the sort of medium or short to medium term effects of the lack of that facility might be. It's obviously served us well in recent years, and I'm comfortable with the portfolio that the council has built up. That's obviously received lots of attention, and it's providing we've got a balanced portfolio with apparently good rates of collection, COVID and everything else notwithstanding. But now that the government's not lending quite so freely on that basis, I wonder what message that sends to other potential sources of finance for similar projects in the future. Inherently, does it make it an awful lot more expensive than it's been to date? And what might the effect be on our medium plans once, fingers crossed, things turn around and the economy starts to curve upwards again? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, so the feedback on the Pwlb decisions following the consultation, though, is that if we had anything in our capital programme, no matter how we were funding it, that related to investment for yield, they wouldn't then lend to us. So fundamentally, we can't have anything in our capital programme that is there purely for yield. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to borrow the money that we want to do to deliver our housing strategy. So we have had to be very mindful of that, and we've had to work in making sure that we've addressed all of those shortfalls that we will have Fundamentally, though, this current year was the last year of the current programme of investment, and that was paused, and we've therefore changed and reflected the medium-term financial position to be in a place where we know we haven't got anything relying on anything new. So unfortunately, the PWLB rules didn't matter who you would be borrowing from. You cannot do that type of investment anymore, because I have to make a personal statement that I'm not investing for any kind of yield. I'm only investing going forward for the purposes as described in the strategy around housing or economic regeneration. It doesn't mean that we can't invest to develop, and therefore we may potentially have a benefit of yield or income coming through from those investments, but our priority reason for doing it will all be about regeneration and developing the city.
Thanks, Annabelle. Can I just ask a quick supplementary then, Chair, on that? Just reassurance, I suppose. The government isn't asking authorities to change the portfolio built up under the old scheme in any radical way, is it? And nor is it about to call in any debts advanced under the old scheme?
No, and there's no retrospective action that we need to take to this, and we're in a position where fundamentally we've internally borrowed to facilitate some of the investment we've done previously, and I now know that I've got assurance that I can go and externalise that borrowing if I needed to. So no, there's no problems about any decisions we've taken before. This is all looking forward to the future.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Carlo, I think you had a question.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yes, Annabelle, you've explained that councils can't borrow for yield, but that there are other criteria where they can borrow for local regeneration, purchasing assets. So I wondered, yes, to ask what the government's criteria are, please, or has the City Council got specific criteria that we're putting forward to make a case for borrowing, please?
So the capital strategy as it's presented provides the rationale for the investment we're doing in the city, and therefore it provides me with the assurance that I can borrow for that purpose. But fundamentally, the key thing that government's looking for us to do, and assurance they're looking from me for, is that you've got a clear political priority. So we'll be using our Norwich 2040 vision, our capital corporate plan, and then once we develop our asset management strategy, we will articulate within there the different ways we will invest in property to facilitate regeneration. So there are several different policies and strategies that I'll be able to look to and reference, but as long as the council's got a clear strategy of which provides the purpose on which we're investing, we'll be able to do it.
Yes. Yeah, just say yes, that's very helpful. Thank you, Annabelle. It would be helpful to have a briefing, a councillor briefing in future on putting all that together and in getting an overview. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Any other questions on this section? Any comments that anyone wishes to make? Okay, thank you. Well, let's move on then to section 6, which is Treasury Management. Who would like to ask a question on Treasury Management?
Just to reiterate that point that was made earlier about
Is that the social value indicator? Did I note that down? Because I was just trying to work out whether that ought to be a recommendation and what that might read like. We sadly this evening don't have anyone able to put any recommendations up on the screen, so we'll rely on just having those read out. But Councillor Graham, can I bring you in on that? Just what might that wording look like?
It might look like asking the Cabinet to put forward a fourth criteria that would be social return on investment, but I think Councillor Osborne has something to say.
Okay, Councillor Osborne.
Yeah, I'd suggest that the Cabinet or the appropriate people can ask our Treasury Management advisors to do that as well, to flesh out what that might mean.
And what page is that on the?
I'll just get it up 1 second. it's 6.68, is it? Paragraph? No, sorry.
Sorry. 6.68.
It's not 6.68, sorry. I'm just trying to find it now. I've got it.
5.3.
No, it's in the Treasury management part, so it's in paragraph
6.45. There's several references to it. 6.54.
Yeah, the 6.45, thank you. So the Council's Treasury management investment priorities will be security first, liquidity second, and then yield. And the proposal would be to include social value in that as well.
To ask our Treasury advisors to see about including social value. Can I get a steer from the committee if that was a sort of recommendation to ask Cabinet to look at asking our Treasury advisors to consider social value? Councillor Giles.
I would certainly welcome research and investigation into it. However, I am concerned about, with regards to it being a recommendation, how realistic some of it is at this moment in time. I mean, obviously, we can't really stop depositing any money in mainstream creditworthy banks and building societies because of individual clients they may have that we think are unethical. We obviously don't know what individual clients they have, and you know, we need to be sure that if we are diverting our short-term investments from where they are currently to more ethical alternatives, that they are creditworthy, because we don't want to lose our money. While I'm certainly in support of research and investigation in this area, and I think it will happen in the future, I would want to be sure that these safeguards are in place.
If the recommendation was around the sort of research and investigation of social value as part of our Treasury investment strategy, would that be acceptable? Yeah, thumbs up to that.
If I may, that's part of the reason for asking, asking the Treasury management advisors to do it. And I think that, you know, it's worth just having it as a criteria to be explored in the same way that, you know, we look at security and yield and liquidity.
But I think, in essence, we're going to ask Cabinet to see about getting some further research on this. Councillor Samesi.
Thank you, Chair. This might be stating the obvious, so I do apologise if that's the case. But I think when we start to say we want to look at it in terms of something like social value, which I'm not against doing, we need to sort of, as part of this recommendation or going forward, think about how we operationalise that concept, what we actually really mean by social value, please.
Thank you. Presumably that would come back as part of the research from the advisors.
I think just to, sorry if I just come in again on, I think it's important to say that, you know, that it doesn't mean that it's contradictory to, or it doesn't mean that we're going to overrule the security and liquidity and yield. It doesn't mean that we're, it's possible to have all of them as criteria.
So how about ask Cabinet to ask Treasury management advisors to research and investigate including social value as part of Treasury management investment priorities. Can I get an indication if people are happy with that wording?
May I say, Chair?
Councillor Graham?
Could I suggest that we say that along with security, liquidity and yield, because we're trying to create another criteria. I mean, I really do share Councillor Giles' reservations about we don't want to make impossible demands, but we do want to give our officers the remit to go ahead and explore it and and bring it to fruition.
I mean, I don't think in that wording we were suggesting that we wouldn't look at security, liquidity and yield. I think it was just simply asking Cabinet to go out and explore an additional option. So I don't think that negates any of those.
It doesn't, but my point was to put them on a par and in the context.
Okay, ask Cabinet to ask Treasury Management Advisors to research and investigate including social value as a fourth criteria of Treasury Management investment priorities.
Yeah.
Yep. Good. Can I get general? Can I have enough thumbs up that we can move on?
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Right. We'll bring that forward as a recommendation. Anything else on Treasury Management? I wasn't proposing to go into sort of detail on items 7, the key financial indicators, and the sort of the glossary of terms in 9, but on 8, Councillor Osborne has indicated that he has a question to ask on item 8.
Chair, can I ask a question on part 6?
On what, sorry?
Can I ask a question on the Treasury Management?
Oh yeah, sure. Sorry, I thought we'd finished that. Far away.
Sorry. It would just be good to hear from Annabelle for people such as myself, a sort of dummy's guide of what the impact of negative interest rates would be on our Treasury Management strategy and our policies, because you know, people like me don't really fully understand all the consequences, so it'd be good to have a dummy's brief guide.
So if I can cover that quite quickly now, I think the biggest impact we have in relation to that is actually the loss of investment income that we see through to the general fund budget. We've also already seen a dramatic reduction in that budget in this financial year that we've had to manage, and fundamentally we're not forecasting an increase in that going forward, because at the end of the day the interest rate forecasts are looking very, very low over the medium term. But fundamentally our approach to how we'd invest that money wouldn't change, because the reality is we still need to make sure it's secure. So just because it's a negative interest rate wouldn't mean that I would hold it all with Barclays, because actually I need to spread that risk with the financial institutions on which we've got the money. So we'd still be giving the same consideration to making sure we've got security before we actually can go for the yield, which is our last criteria. So that a principle and approach wouldn't change. Unfortunately, the reality would be we'd have an expenditure budget for asking people to look after our money, rather than actually getting income into the council for an interest return on that investment.
Would there be any positive benefits for us in terms of borrowing?
Well, the longer term interest rates that we'd be looking to try and utilise, because our investments are actually purchasing of assets when we're looking at new housing investment over a much longer term, and those interest rates reflect the movement that we'll see going forward. So as much as we've got historically low interest rates, I'm not anticipating that those rates will be going down much lower, because it will be constantly looking at the longer term projection, and that's where the interest rate moves in that field. So I don't expect we'll be seeing much more of a benefit on interest rates going down, because we are at historically low rates. And one of the benefits though of what the Pwlb have done is they did take a decision at very little notice last year to actually increase Pwlb rates by 1%. But what they did by clarifying the policy around where you can borrow money is they brought that interest rate back down by the 1%. So they did it more quickly when it was in relation to housing, but they've brought it down across the board now. So we are in a position where we do have an opportunity with our regeneration, which is why we want to do the asset management strategy in a very methodical approach to it, because there may be opportunities that we'll want to invest now for the future, and we want to look at that in a methodical way.
Thank you. Any other questions that I missed on item 6? Okay, thank you. Item 8, which is the Chief Officer's statement, Chief Finance Officer's statement. Councillor Osborne, I believe you have a question on that.
Yes, sorry to add another question. This is the very last paragraph, 8.10 on page 156. It says the Chief Finance Officer has some reservations about the deliverability of the capital strategy, and mentions potentially the probable slippage in the capital programme. I was just wondering what that referred to, if we could have more detail on that.
Yeah, so as you'll be aware, we actually start planning and working up our capital programme well in advance of setting the budget in February. So actually all services were looking at proposals, you know, literally this time last year, and we've been working them up all through. But what we actually do is we have to take a line in the sand, and that was done before Christmas. All I'm trying to identify here is we wouldn't have time to then rework and reevaluate what a potential lockdown would mean. And therefore, I just wanted to make you aware that all of those figures were presented on the basis pre our knowledge of being in this current lockdown, and the fact that there may be some slippage in relation to that. But we did a lot of work before actually putting the budget proposal together pre-Christmas, looking at what our capacity was to deliver. We're very aware that we got hit quite hard with the pandemic this year, and it has meant a lot of what we'd hoped to do we haven't been able to do. And we spent quite a lot of time as a team working with our partners to make sure we from where we stand today, we thought we would be able to deliver it. But as you know, with any capital scheme, it's not until you've gone through full planning that you know whether there'll be any additional things you need to do. Not until you put a spade in the ground sometimes you know exactly what may come up. So there will always be capital slippage. I just wanted to make it really clear that this programme was set pre the known lockdown that we're currently in, and that will undoubtedly impact us a little bit next year.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that. Any other questions on item 8? No, if not, in which case, thank you to everyone for your participation this evening. Thank you to all the officers for being here to answer questions, and thank you to the various portfolio holders and the leader for being here as well. So, and on that, I will close the meeting. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much to the officers. Thanks.